Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I am your host TJ Mabardi. We have a surprising amount of news coming both from the NFL and the NBA in terms of coaching changes. So we will be touching on that today. But first, we are going to talk about the San Francisco 49ers, who are hosting the NFC Championship game this week after somewhat of a shaky performance against a much younger and lower expectation Green Bay Packers team. So we are going to be answering the question of should the 49ers be worried after their close call. We're then going to be giving a broad update on the NFL coaching carousel before continuing that coaching trend into the third segment, where we will be talking about the breaking news of the Milwaukee Bucks yesterday firing their head coach during the season and then replacing him with an NBA legend. And then in our final segment, we're going to be talking about none other than the Los Angeles Lakers. I haven't had a chance to talk about them just yet. They just lost their game last night to fall back under 500. So we are going to talk about what they need to do to turn their season around. Before we get into the show, please remember to like and follow. And for any of your live questions, use the link that is streaming across the bottom ticker. That is streamelements.com/gsmcsportsnetwork./tip. So without further ado, getting into our first segment here in the San Francisco 49ers and whether or not they should be worried for their upcoming matchup about the Detroit Lions. And during the next 2 days, we are going to be talking about the specific matchup and the preview of their game coming up against the Lions. But before we do that, I wanted to just sort of come back around on their performance from last Saturday, because I talked about it some in the show on Monday, but I was very much taken aback about how the 49ers performed then. I thought that they were outplayed for a large portion of that game. And now if you didn't watch the game and if you were to go look at the box score and the team stats, you could come at me with plenty of stats that would say that I'm wrong. And that was something that I sort of noticed looking back on this game, is you really wouldn't be able to tell that the Packers did outperform the 49ers, but I trust my eyes. I saw what I saw. I thought that the Packers left a lot of opportunities on the field, and had they not, I think that this very easily could have been a Green Bay Packers Detroit Lions NFC Championship. Now, the Packers, they were just 2-5 in the red zone. They had a lot of dropped interceptions. Those interceptions coming off of the fact that Brock Purdy really didn't seem too comfortable throughout the course of the game. We covered it before, and a lot of people have covered it at this point. The whole glove debacle, whether or not he was going to wear one, because the weather was bad in San Francisco. It was a very sloppy game. I don't think necessarily from the play itself, but you had defenders falling all over the place that actually helped lead to, on one of the worst cases of it, the Green Bay Packers getting a wide open receiver in the back of the end zone for a touchdown. So it was happening all throughout the game, but it seemed like Brock Purdy especially was sort of struggling with this weather. Now, we saw him in different circumstances because of the fact that just about everybody was going down in the game against the Cleveland Browns during the regular season, when a lot of people first started sort of having their doubts with Brock Purdy and with this 49ers team. Now, he somewhat dealt with it just by the fact that Deebo Samuel, their number one receiver, did leave early in that game and was not a factor due to a couple different injuries. It seemed like at first it was a head injury, and then it was a shoulder injury. So Debo is obviously a huge factor for this team, and especially as Greg Olson pointed out on the broadcast, when you're game planning to have your best receiver for 2 weeks and you lose him within the first drive or so, it is very hard to overcome that. So credit to the 49ers for being able to do so. I think that Kyle Shanahan, another person that, obviously has a big reputation due to his offensive style. Some of the matchups between him and McVay, it seemed that these are some of the best offensive minds. Mike McDaniel, all of these guys come from the same coaching tree, so it makes sense that they have very similar styles and that they are all so well perceived, I should say. But the Packers had this game. They had the 49ers, you could say on the ropes, but not quite. They had a 4-point lead. They were up 21-17 against the 49ers, driving down the field. They had the ball on the San Francisco 23-yard line with 6:21 left. They lined up to San Francisco held up. So again, credit to them. The Packers lined up for a 41-yard field goal, but they missed that, and it just seems like any time, especially come the playoffs, you miss those important kicks, they are going to come back to hurt you. Brock Purdy then leads the 12-play, 69-yard touchdown drive for the 49ers to take the 3-point lead. And then after that final Jordan Love interception, the 49ers came out on top. So it sort of feels like the 49ers escaped the game there for a Packers team that, again, they probably weren't even supposed to be there. They weren't supposed to be in that game even necessarily as far as a competition standpoint. I mean, they were over a touchdown underdog against the Dallas Cowboys. I think it closed at 7.5. And then going into this game, they were 9.5-point underdogs against the 49ers. And again, I think that you can absolutely make the argument that they should have won that game. It feels like it got away from them. That being said, it is the Niners coming out on top, so you have to give them some credit there. Shanahan finally getting the win after 31 games. He was 0-30 in games that his team was trailing by at least 7 points entering the fourth quarter. They pull off that comeback, get that monkey off of his back, and they advance to, again, host an NFC Championship game, which these appearances have been very common under Kyle Shanahan-led 49ers teams. So the Detroit Lions are going to be coming into Levi's Stadium to try and make the first Super Bowl appearance in Detroit Lions history. So they're going to be hungry. Dan Campbell, I think, is an excellent leader. And you can absolutely make the argument that now, after sort of having all this momentum and getting to this spot, that they could come out a little bit flat. But I don't think that a Dan Campbell-led team will come out flat in a moment like this. I think that they are really rolling. They're really feeling themselves. I think that their win against the Rams in the wild card round is honestly one of the most impressive wins so far in the postseason up to this point. So the 49ers are going to have a lot on their hands, absolutely. So I wanted to look into some of the keys. Again, we'll be getting into the full-blown preview as the week goes on, but just for San Francisco here, the first of which being sort of the elephant in the room, is Deebo Samuel going to be able to play? Now, like I mentioned, head injury early and then with a shoulder injury that kept him out for the rest of the game. Now, they have already came out and said that Deebo, he avoided any sort of a fracture or serious injury in that sense. But as of today, on Wednesday, January 24th, he is listed as questionable for the game this weekend. Game plan wise, I do think that at least now they can prepare for the possibility of not having him and almost getting away with having that in-game loss last week and still being able to overcome it. I think that that was the harder task necessarily than coming into this week knowing that he might not play, or even if he does, he might be limited. Again, I think that Greg Olson should deserve a ton of credit for how good of an announcer he's been in these situations, because he's pointing out on jet sweeps and such for Juwan Jennings that they very likely chance was that that was supposed to be Deebo Samuel taking those types of plays, and now they're trying to plug in different players in that Deebo slot. And Juwan Jennings is a nice player. He had a pretty solid game, I thought, this past Saturday, I should say. But he's not Deebo Samuel, and not many people are. So that's not necessarily an insult to him. But again, I think that it speaks to the perseverance of this 49ers team, which you have to give them credit for. And then I think that so it goes without being said that not having Deebo Samuel would be a tremendous loss for this 49ers team, especially when you're playing against a Lions team that they have a very high-powered offense as well. So these two teams both can put points on the boards. Deebo Samuel has been a large part of that. You just hope that he's going to be able to play. Now, another factor, I alluded to it as a reason why I think that Brock Purdy wasn't on his A game, the weather. And, maybe it's unfair to sort of make up this reoccurring theme that Purdy can't play well in the weather. Recent examples would possibly show that that is the case, but truthfully, it's such a small sample size, and there are also so many other factors when you talk about that Browns game. You're playing what was probably the best, if not the second best, between the defense in the league. It's either between the Browns or the Ravens for the best defense in the league. I think the other one has to be the second best in the league. So there's that. All the injuries that they dealt with throughout the course of that game alone, Trent Williams, Deebo Samuel, Christian McCaffrey, all of those were important factors, and they still almost came away with that one. And then this past game where, yes, the Packers defense isn't necessarily elite. They do have a lot of talent, but a bit of a coaching, Joe Barry was the defensive coordinator for the Green Bay Packers, but he has sort of had an up and down season, up and down tenure within Green Bay, and I thought that he was actually pretty good in the postseason, but a team that has had a reputation of not being a great defensive unit from the coaching staff down, and he struggled there, but this is also a playoff game. So again, all of this to be said that the weather actually does look better so far in Santa Clara, California as of this point. So it's just sort of a sneaky storyline that I, at least myself, am paying attention to, and I think could be a factor for how the 49ers come out and play on Sunday. Now, I just mentioned Joe Barry and that he was the defensive coordinator for the Green Bay Packers. There's been a whole lot of coaching carousel moves, coordinators being hired, coordinators being fired. So we will take a look at all of that when we come back on the other side of the break, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, I'll diss my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits, I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip, you choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. Oh, I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We just talked about the San Francisco 49ers and some of their struggles on this past Saturday during their divisional round matchup against the Packers. Now, speaking of the Packers and others, there has been a good amount of coaching change, as there always is come the offseason. So we are going to be giving an update on all of the coaching moves across the league so far. Now, starting off, we have a head coaching hire from the Tennessee Titans, and there have been a few times on the show that I've mentioned just how much talent there is in the coaching carousel right now. It's actually a name I have not yet mentioned. That is, they hired the Bengals offensive coordinator, Brian Callahan. Callahan has been the Bengals offensive coordinator for the past 5 seasons. He was really helpful in bringing Joe Burrow along. Now, Joe Burrow, a great talent, of course, but there is always that little bit of adjustment to the NFL. I think that Callahan has done a very good job doing so. Now, Cincinnati disappointed this season, but I don't think that you could point to Callahan for the reason why that would be the case. They were dealt some poor hands, I should say, when it comes to Joe Burrow injuries. He had the calf injury in the preseason that kept him out for most of training camp. And when he came back, he still wasn't 100%. You could see him with the massage gun on the sideline frequently, but he started to ramp up eventually. Bengals had a big win against the 49ers, who we just talked about. And at that moment, it was like, okay, they are sort of coming back to life here. These are the Bengals we know. And then just a few weeks later on primetime television against the Ravens, he goes down again with a season-ending injury with a torn ligament in his wrist. So, unfortunate. Burrow ends up only playing 10 games, and even in those 10 games, he was maybe at close to full strength for just 2 or 3 of those, if that. So, an unfortunate season for Bengals fans. Now, I thought that Brian Callahan, despite the obstacles, I thought that he still handled it pretty well. I thought that Jake Browning, the backup quarterback, when he came in, I thought that he was really impressive, especially in the game against the Jaguars. I thought that he was great. And I think that when you consider all of the factors that went into this Bengals season, I don't think that Callahan really should be at fault. Now, they have a very talented offense, for sure. They have Joe Mixon, a great running back, and they have had, up to this point, maybe the best receiver trio in the league between Jamar Chase, T. Higgins, and totally blanking on the third receiver right now. But they've had a very good offensive skill position group around them. And now, on the other side of the ball, what happens, as we've seen plenty of times, is once you sort of have this rise up, you have to start paying guys, and you can't pay everybody, so there ends up being a lot of turnover. That was the case, especially in the secondary for Cincinnati's defense, and as a result, they took a step back. They had a lot of youth in that group, and they just weren't the same effective group that they were for their Super Bowl run a couple years ago. They were 27th in pass defense, 26th in run defense, and 22nd in scoring. So they were not a great group this year. I just think that all of this is important because if you are asking yourself, well, why would the Bengals offensive coordinator get a head coaching job after this season? I think that it's important to consider the circumstances that they were under and that they were, it's a body of work over the handful of these years. And I think that this is probably a pretty good hire for the Titans. Now, do I think that they should have moved on from Mike Vrabel even in the first place? No. So we'll see how this all plays out. I like Vrabel a lot, and I think that there was a lot of talent in the pool. I think that as far as coordinator jobs go, I know that he can't really do these interviews and fully commit to a job yet, but I really like Ben Johnson of the Lions, the offensive coordinator there. So all in all, I think this is about a B signing for them. I think that they could have possibly done better. They definitely could have done worse, though. So I'd give it about a B, just off of initial reactions here. On to Philadelphia, where they just yesterday fired their offensive coordinator, Brian Johnson. Now, this goes along with the firing of their defensive coordinator, Sean Desai, a few days ago. Matt Patricia, who took over defensive play calling duties and a lot of Desai's responsibilities around the 10-1 mark. I believe it was after one of those losses that Patricia took over, and Patricia is no longer expected to be back either. He has an expiring contract coming up in this offseason. It expired come this offseason, and it's not expected that he will be back. So another offseason of sort of getting a fresh slate here in Philadelphia, because last year, if you'll remember, they had both their offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator hired to head coaching positions elsewhere in the league. Shane Steichen, he went on to the Colts, and defensive coordinator Jonathan Gannon was hired by the Cardinals. So another offseason of a clean house here in Philadelphia. They had a collapse, and after starting 10-1, and this is sort of what happens when you fall as far as they do. I agree with them keeping Nick Sirianni. I'm not the biggest Nick Sirianni fan myself, but I think that's just more of, I don't really like his antics. The players seem to really have his back, though. Fletcher Cox called a reporter a clown, I think, when he was asked about Sirianni's future. If you have the locker room, that's where it all begins, and if the players are there for Sirianni, then I think that they can't let Sirianni go after 2 seasons, a Super Bowl appearance, one that they very easily could have won, and then, yes, a disappointing this year, but still a playoff run, still a playoff appearance, I should say. There wasn't much running when they got there, but I think that keeping him is the right decision. So naturally, the steps of progression are that the coordinators are going to go. So we will see where the Eagles choose to go from there. Now, I sort of alluded to it earlier in the first segment. Joe Barry has been fired from the Green Bay Packers. He was their defensive coordinator for a few seasons, 3, I believe. And it's not a huge surprise, really. If you were following the Packers during the regular season, they were not very good on the defensive side of the ball. And really, for years, there's been complaints about the misuse of players. Jair Alexander, while he does struggle with health, yes, he is one of the best cornerbacks in the league. And a lot of people have been, Packers fans specifically, have been very concerned about the way that he chooses to use him and the other talent on that side of the ball. So I'm not surprised, but I think that it is interesting. He probably, Joe Barry that is, put together two of his best coaching performances in the playoffs. Now, a lot of it was the Cowboys collapsing. There was some really weird stuff going on there in Dallas in the first round with CeeDee Lamb and Dak Prescott from the first play not getting along there. So, I don't know. You can make the argument that it was self-inflicted by the other teams. It was the weather against San Francisco, but I thought that he did actually sort of have at least a chance of keeping his job just because of those last two games. But again, not surprised ultimately when it comes to the Packers' decision to move on. So talking about some head coaching stuff, still don't have a ton of news on that other than the Titans' decision, but we've at least heard some rumblings, some buzz about what is going on with the other top candidates here. Now, Bill Belichick, he has taken 2 meetings with the Atlanta Falcons. He's been very heavily linked with them from the beginning of the offseason. Now, it's interesting that the interviews really aren't going much further than Atlanta at this point. I thought that there would maybe be some more potential suitors. The Chargers, a lot of people liked to link to him because there's a quarterback there and he just has to correct this defense that has been horrible for them the past few years under Brandon Staley. But I can at least understand, it's the West Coast for Belichick. You got to keep in mind how old he is, the lifestyle that he wants to live. I'm not shocked that there isn't mutual interest there. I thought that Washington would be a little bit more of an interesting location, and there really hasn't been much noise there. I don't actually think that Ron Rivera has been officially let go yet at this point. I could be wrong on that. I think that, and I'm not, I don't like to advocate for people losing their jobs, but I think it would be crazy if they went into next season with Ron Rivera as well. Now, they have Eric Bieniemy on the coaching staff there already, so I don't know if they have some sort of a succession plan as it is there, but not a lot of love for Bill Belichick as far as the coaching carousel has gone up to this point, which I just find interesting. One of the other key names in this offseason of coaching, Jim Harbaugh, likely to make the switch from college football back to the NFL. The Chargers have been very much linked to him. We'll sort of get on that a little bit. He is, I did see a report that he is still reportedly in play for the Falcons as well. So the Falcons have been taking a lot of interviews up to this point. Even with interviewing Bill Belichick 2 times, they are keeping their options open. And that could include Jim Harbaugh, but off of the jump of the offseason, and really once Harbaugh left Michigan, a lot of people have been talking about him to the Chargers. Now, interestingly enough, there has been some recent reports that Pete Carroll is actually potentially in play for that job as well. I don't think that he was really looking to coach elsewhere when he was told that he wasn't going to be returning as the coach next season for the Seahawks. And this is actually the main destination he would want to go to if that were the case. So still monitoring a lot of this stuff. It's interesting though how these 3 legendary coaches of their own right are sort of connected for these same jobs, trying to battle it out here. So I am very interested in how this plays out. It's also worth mentioning that the Raiders have retained Antonio Pierce, their interim coach for this past season. He will be the head coach going into next year. I think that's the far and away clear choice for the Raiders after really screwing up a couple years ago when they had the interim coach situation and they end up bringing in Josh McDaniels, and that was bad from the jump. So I'm glad that Antonio Pierce gets his chance. The players loved him there, and it just seemed like the right thing to do. So that is the NFL coaching carousel update. We're going to be sticking with head coaching gigs in the next segment when we jump to the NBA, and we will be talking about some breaking news from the association, so stick around.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Hello and welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Just finished up updating the NFL head coaching and coordinator cycle, and on that note, we're going to be moving on to the NBA, where we had, in my opinion, a very surprising move from one of the best teams in basketball in terms of their head coaching decision. Yesterday, the Bucks fired their first-year head coach, Adrian Griffin, after just 43 games, in which they went 30-13 during the stretch and were second in the Eastern Conference. It was clear that there was something going on behind the scenes really for a while. It really started during the Bucks in-season tournament loss against the Pacers, where there were some stories that came out. I think Chris Haynes had it first, that in the locker room afterwards, there were some words exchanged between Griffin and Bobby Portis. Griffin was getting on the team's case about rebounding and playing with more effort, sacrificing, and Bobby Portis also called out Adrian Griffin, saying that he needs to be better and actually coach them, especially later in games, on offense and do more. So an exchange of words then, and from there it seemed like Adrian Griffin had just lost the locker room. Giannis had some interesting moments throughout the course of the year where his body language was just off, and naturally when you have your star player unhappy, these are the things that tend to happen across the NBA. The Bucks were second in the league in offensive rating. Now, obviously, a lot of talent on that end of the ball, but they were 21st in defensive rating and not getting any better. And yes, you have maybe some lackluster guards to help contribute on that side of the ball between Damian Lillard and Malik Beasley. They had traded Grayson Allen to acquire Damian Lillard, which obviously an offensive upgrade, but you still looked at their defense, and Chris Middleton, we'll see. I think that he's had his moments, but he hasn't really been the vintage Chris Middleton that he was for the Bucks championship run a couple seasons ago. And when you have that much of a lackluster group defensively, it is obviously a tough task. Now, that being said, they do still have two defensive anchors, Giannis Antetokounmpo and Brook Lopez, who should be raising the floor of your defense. Brook Lopez has still been great this season. Giannis, I thought that he was maybe going to have a little bit more of an impact on that side of the ball, given the fact that Dame was coming in and could take some of the offensive load off of him. But all in all, they have just been a bad product on that side of the ball. And I think that that was some of the fans' gripes with this team. But ultimately, I think it comes down to that locker room. It sounds like from that loss on, the team really didn't have faith in him, and trying to continue on this run with a coach who hasn't proven anything. You are a championship expectation team. You did so a couple seasons ago. Yes, the group isn't exactly the same anymore, but that is what the guys in that locker room are thinking. We are playing for a championship here, and they just didn't really believe that he was the one who could get them to that. So then come today, there were reports last night by CNN and such, TNT, during the in-between time from the Nets and Knicks game and the Lakers and Clippers game. They were talking about how Doc Rivers was working his way to an agreement with the Milwaukee Bucks. ESPN picked it up today and officially declared the contract agreement. So Doc Rivers is now the head coach of the Milwaukee Bucks. Doc Rivers was just fired by the 76ers after last season. The Sixers blew a 3-2 lead to the Boston Celtics, and he was let go. Was pretty good, I think, doing play-by-play and announcing on some of these national TV games for the season, but we're going to have to hold off on hearing more of him from the booth because he will be on the sideline in Milwaukee. So, in my opinion, I think that Doc Rivers was the best immediate answer. It's obviously the middle of the season. The halfway point just struck for most of, if not all, the teams within the past week, reaching game 41 of the 82-game season. So, I think that they put themselves in a bad position through the past year or so, and desperate times call for desperate measures. I like Doc Rivers, but it is very fair, I think, for people to have concerns with him based off of how the last few years of his coaching career have gone. And I think that just before we get into Doc Rivers himself, just sort of laying out the timeline here, because the Bucks decided to fire Mike Budenholzer coming off of the upset in the playoffs this year where they lost. They were the 1 seed and lost to the 8th seeded Miami Heat team. Now, I was never a huge fan of Mike Budenholzer. I don't know. I thought that he was very stubborn in some of his philosophies. The heavy drop coverage from Brook Lopez on defense as far as in the screen game, making sure Brook Lopez plays in the paint as opposed to coming up and contesting shooters. I thought that at times that hurt him and the team, but at the same time, he helped Brook Lopez, get national recognition for being an all defensive center for their team, and they won the championship in 2021. And when that happened, and I was still sort of concerned with Budenholzer, I'm like, okay, well, you know what? He just got himself another 10 years of a leash here, because I think that up to that point, that was the point in time where Giannis had a couple MVPs, but not much playoff success. Budenholzer maybe had a coach of the year at that point with Milwaukee, but again, hadn't gotten over the hump yet. And I thought that in 2021, if they didn't win, that could be Budenholzer's last year. But then they go on to win it. And I thought that, things were going to go forward like this, but they were not. Now, if you look back to last season in their loss to the Heat, you can call it an embarrassment, but obviously Giannis missed the majority of that series, and the Miami Heat ended up going to the finals. So I don't think that it's quite as embarrassing as people may make it out to be. Yes, the 1 versus 8 never looks good, but it's hard to do when your star player misses most of that series and the team that you're playing wasn't a real 8 seed. Like, yes, they almost lost to the Bulls, interestingly enough. Nobody ever talks about that. The fact that they almost didn't make the playoffs in general because they were trailing the Bulls in the play-in tournament, but end up coming back there and then making the run all the way to the finals. So I think that it's not that bad of a look for Budenholzer himself. I don't know how much more he could have done. Chris Middleton, he's made steps this season, but even last year he was even less of himself, and it was asking an older Drew Holiday to be the offensive and defensive anchor on the perimeter. I don't think that the circumstances were great there for them, and I didn't really agree with the decision to fire him then. I think it gets even more interesting when you consider the timeline of the fact that at that time they didn't know that they were going to have the chance even to trade for Damian Lillard. And looking back at it, I don't know if they would have fired him if they knew they were getting Dame, because Dame is now in his 30s on a very expensive contract, and I think that when you make that sort of a trade, you're doing so for one reason, mostly one reason, to win a championship. I think it was also to show Giannis that they were committed to him long term. But I think that was the initial idea of moving off of Budenholzer and finding a coach that Giannis liked, was we want to make our star player happy for the time to come. And in that process, they made some questionable moves, in my opinion. And it's hard, again, especially in the NBA, where this is such a players-driven league, to openly go against your star player. But reports in the past 24 hours have come out that Nick Nurse, who was with the Raptors when they won the finals in 2019, he was almost the creator of the wall type defense that has tried to be replicated. There's no fully stopping Giannis, but the wall idea came from that finals run by Nick Nurse and the Raptors in that postseason run that sort of stuck around with Giannis for, again, nobody's stopping this guy, but the best defense almost possible to guard him was generated from Nick Nurse. Now, I'm not sure why, but Giannis did not want to play for Nick Nurse. He made that very clear in the offseason, despite Nick Nurse being a finalist for the position based off of people in the front office wanting him. But when they heard that Giannis did not want to play for him, they cast him aside. He ends up signing with the Philadelphia 76ers, and we've seen the success that the Sixers have had this season. Now, they've always been a good regular season team these past handful of years, but you get the point. I think that Nick Nurse is a very good coach in the league, and it's hard to say they made the mistake by not hiring him, based off of the fact that Giannis would have been upset if they did, because that's just what the NBA is right now. But if you know you're not going to be able to hire, and maybe this is unfair of me to say, but if you know you're not going to be able to hire the best coach available on the market because of any factor, this one being that Giannis didn't want to play for him, why let go of the good coach you already have? I don't think Budenholzer was great, but I thought he was good enough. He showed that he was good enough, and they end up firing him and bringing in Adrian Griffin, who was more so Giannis's pick, and it seems like they're hurt as a result of this. And that brings us to yesterday, where 43 games into the season, they don't have a head coach anymore. So again, I think that Doc was the best solution available to them at that time. Doc Rivers is a very historic coach. He won the finals in 2008 with the Celtics. He's won a Coach of the Year award in the past. But there's also a little bit of negative history that follows him. He's blown 3-1 leads. He's 6-10 as a head coach in Game 7s, and he's lost the last 5 of which. One of them came last year after blowing a 3-2 lead against the Celtics. So there's just a lot of baggage, a lot of different ways to look at the way that this is all played out. And I think it's going to be tough for him to get acclimated with this team already halfway through the year. But at least it's not like they have a lot of room in the standings to make up for. They are the number 2 seed. They're just a few games out from the number 1 seeded Boston Celtics. So it's not like they have to fully rediscover themselves and figure out new philosophies to work. That offense is baseline very good. A defense is going to need work. And I think that they might need work from outside of the organization. They might have to make a trade. I don't know. I think that after finding out all of this news and such, I don't think I'd have them in the top 2 teams in the Eastern Conference. I would have the Celtics above them, and I would have the Miami Heat above them. And I think it's also, if you want to assume that Joel Embiid is fully healthy, I also think that them and the Sixers are, just neck and neck. The top of the East is very loaded. So it's going to be difficult to try and reimagine themselves on the fly like this going into the playoffs. But we'll see. Doc Rivers has done so before. So we will just have to be continuing to monitor the situation. So that's all we have on the Bucks. We're going to be sticking in the NBA and talking about the Los Angeles Lakers on the other side of the break. So stick with us. Welcome back to the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We are going into our final segment here. Today we have talked about the 49ers. We've talked about the head coaching carousel. We just wrapped up talking about Doc Rivers being hired by the Milwaukee Bucks. We are finishing off the show today by talking about the Los Angeles Lakers. If you missed any of the previous segments, check out our YouTube to get those. But for now, we will be moving on to the last segment of the day, the Los Angeles Lakers. So last night, they lost to the LA Clippers 127-116 in the first night of NBA rivalry night, which a lot of people are sort of coming at it saying it's maybe corny and that they are trying too hard to force rivalries and such. I think it's cool. I know that, the NBA isn't quite as packed with rivalries as maybe it once was, but it does still have some intriguing back and forths. Like one, for example, that I think that people are just sort of overlooking to a little bit of a degree is the San Antonio Spurs and the OKC Thunder who are playing. Now, I know both of these teams are very different in talent and expectations as it currently stands, but I think that Victor Wembanyama and Chet Holmgren is actually a very compelling matchup. I know that it wasn't good the last time that they played, but Wemby is so much better now than he was at the time. This was within the first month of the season. I think that he's leaps and bounds better than he was when the league started. So that's just a quick aside on this rivalry week initiative from the NBA. Last night, the Lakers played in one of these matchups, and they lost to their rival across the town, to the Clippers. Now, LeBron James did not play in this game. He had an ankle injury, so he sat this one out. And despite that, the Lakers were actually still in this game. They had a 2-point game a couple times in the fourth quarter, but just couldn't get it done. The Clippers are a very good team this season. They are missing their center, Ivica Zubac, right now. So both teams a little shorthanded, but the Lakers obviously are so much more reliant on LeBron James than the Clippers are at Zubac. So the Lakers fall to 22-23. They fall under 500 once again. They are the 9th seed in the Western Conference. The teams that are ahead of them right now, the 8th-seeded Dallas Mavericks, 7th-seeded Sacramento Kings. Phoenix has climbed up from the struggle that they were under. The Pelicans are up there, and then all the usual suspects that are at the top of the conference that the Lakers probably don't have to worry about because they are probably not catching that. I think that when you look at the Lakers in general, right? For me, I just want to sort of get out ahead of this. If the Lakers are in a playoff series, they're a scary team. Especially because if they are healthy, I have no doubt that LeBron James can elevate his game to a level that we don't see on a night-to-night basis during the regular season. I think a microcosm of that was the in-season tournament where he was tremendous during the run because, for various different reasons, I think that he was trying to help the NBA sort of raise the platform of this in-season tournament, get more people invested in it. He was phenomenal. And then obviously Anthony Davis in the finals of that game was a monster. So I don't doubt that those two stars can be just as good of a duo as anybody else in the league when they fully want to bring it out. The concern for them, though, is the fact that despite these two players who Anthony Davis has been sort of made fun of for a handful of years now for not being able to stay healthy, LeBron James, currently 39 years old, they've been actually present and playing in just about every game so far this season. LeBron has played in 40 of their 45 games. Anthony Davis has only missed 2 games, playing in 43 of 45 games. So having these stars be as available as they have been, and for two guys that haven't been quite as available in the past handful of seasons and still being sub 500 is a concern to me. Now, again, you get to that play-in tournament, everything sort of changes, but I don't think that they're going to have what it takes really to climb their way out of the 7 through 10 seed to avoid being a part of the play-in tournament in general. And I think that they're going to need to make some moves on their roster because they have a lot of fine players. Like D'Angelo Russell is fine, and if you just look at his stats, he's having a very impressive scoring season. But it's just tough when you consider the defense, some of the decision making from him. He's making a lot of money, which sort of restricts their other moves. Now, it almost seemed like him and Rui Hachimura, the Lakers, signed them to these contracts to help make them be able to pair up with other potential stars come the trade deadline. I think that one guy in particular that they were really looking at trying to acquire was Kyrie Irving. There were reports that Kyrie was even mutually interested during LeBron's playoff run and during the offseason of coming to the Lakers, but the Mavericks are currently ahead of the Lakers in the standings right now. And, if you are Kyrie and the Mavericks, I think that your ceiling probably isn't as high as the Lakers is, especially if Kyrie were to go to LA. But I think that Kyrie's probably a little happy with where he is right now. I think that him and Luka have definitely developed a better relationship this year than they had last year. And they're getting a lot of very good production from some role players. Dante Exum, Grant Williams, Derek Lively, their first round rookie. Derek Jones Jr. has proven me wrong. I was not high on him at all, and when I saw he was starting games for them, I was very concerned, but he's doing what he needs to as a 3-and-D player. Josh Green has been playing well recently. So, Maxi Kleber, I think coming off the bench, this was a guy who was forced into that starting role for a while, and it's like, that's sort of a hole. Now, him coming off the bench, I think, is a totally different monster. I think that he's a good presence on both ends. So, I actually like this Mavericks team more than I was expecting to. And I don't know if Kyrie is going to be an available piece for them to add. So then you start looking around, it's like, well, who are the other stars that are going to be available? Zach LaVine is a name that's been shopped around a lot, and Zach LaVine, I definitely, if he were traded to the Lakers and, became a better player, bought in more on the defensive side of the ball, and, could excel more as not having to be a true number one, but also still being able to have the room of taking over a game at times. I mean, I don't hate, it's a lot of money for him. It's a lot of money, which would be my concern, but I don't hate it for the Lakers there. DeMar DeRozan on the same team, obviously. I don't think that works because there's not enough perimeter shooting, but I just don't think that there are going to be that many stars available. Could they make a Godfather package for a Donovan Mitchell? Maybe. But the Cavs are playing unbelievable right now, and I just don't think that there's going to be the star talent on the market. So what do the Lakers need? They need shooting, baseline. That is very obvious, and it has been obvious. They're relying on a lot of guys who are very spotty. You have Rui Hachimura playing big minutes for them. Jared Vanderbilt can't really shoot a lick. And they've had shooters on their team. I think it's crazy that Malik Beasley's been one of the best shooters in the NBA this season. He was just sitting on the bench in LA last year when we were still sort of talking about the problems with shooting. Now, I think that an underrated part of the Lakers game here is they're actually very impressive running out in transition. I think better than I was expecting. I think that Cam Reddish has been solid for them. Taurean Prince has been solid for them. I like their wing depth, honestly, for the most part. And they are 9th in the league in pace right now, and they play pretty well out of that high pace, which you wouldn't expect because of LeBron and AD being as old as they are, but part of it's just the maestro that LeBron is, being able to make huge passes out in transition and get those teams running. They do actually have a good amount of rookies and young players. Hood Schifino, Maxwell Lewis. They have Christie from last year that they drafted late. And I think that they're not super far away is the thing. Their season relies on LeBron and AD being healthy. As long as that happens, they should be a playoff team, and I think they come out of a play-in tournament. But when you look at the top of the West and you look at the Minnesotas, who I know a lot of people are down on them right now, may be fair, but really it's just all about the Nuggets. And eventually, once you get to the Suns, if they can fully come into their own, I don't think that they have the true offensive firepower to keep up with these teams. Their defense is good enough, but I don't think that they are a top team in their conference right now. And I think that they're going to have to be active in the trade deadline to improve their roster. So that is all I have for today. Thank you very much for tuning into the GSMC Sports Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Don't forget to like and follow. It helps us out a lot. And we will be back tomorrow. Thanks again.